So what I want to do is at the beginning of this, just do what I do at the beginning of each of our discussions together, just do a quick refreshing our recollection as to what the key points were of what we covered in the last discussion, sort of like previously on Homeland. We discussed the following, and I made three key points last Monday to you. The first was that William Strauss and Neil Howe, in their book Generations, had in fact set forth a 100-year cycle that they said explained the sort of unconscious sociological dynamics behind American culture that explain why it is that there is going to be a major crisis in the 21st century here, coming up probably between 2015 and 2045, probably in the area of 2000, by 2030 should be in sort of full bloom, if in fact it maintains the same pattern, and that the crisis is going to be equivalent to the scale of the crises that were experienced during our Revolutionary War, our American Civil War, and back during the period between the Great Depression and World War II, the World War. They also explained why, in their judgment, it was going to be your generation, your millennial generation, and our baby boom generation that were going to partner to actually address this crisis, and refreshing our recollection of the deep ideals and principles of our country, come to grips with the practical problems of this crisis and resolve it. And it was the second point was that it was my judgment that this particular secular crisis is in fact going to occur, and secondly, that the nature of the secular crisis was going to be made up of two major events. One is the major global climate change, and I went into some detail as to what the particulars of this would be, relating to melting of the polar ice caps, the dissipation of the 70% of the fresh water on the planet into the oceans, changing the salination levels and density, causing the underwater currents to rise to the surface and dissipate, and thereby dramatically cooling the temperate zones where most of the food on the planet is grown, and also major storms being increased, the severity of storms, and causing inundations inland up to 20 miles of salt water, and contaminating up to a third of the other remaining 30% of the fresh water on the planet in the aquifers. And that this was going to lead to water wars, with a reduction down to only maybe 20% of the amount of water on the planet that we have now, and also major wars because of the mass migration of up to 53% of all the population on the planet that lives within those 20 miles of the seacoasts around the world, inland to areas that are already populated by other people. And that was and that the second feature of this major crisis would be the rising of a major national security state on the planet to suppress dissent and to utilize the emergency of the major global climate change and its repercussions as a justification for massive repression of individual liberties. And the third point that I made of the three major points was that historically it has proven true that it is required that the actual crisis itself be already fully underway before the civic generation of that particular cycle comes to grips with the fact that it's going to require profound and fundamental political and structural change in the culture in order to effectively address that crisis, rather than just tinkering some with the system presently, and that it is going to take that crisis in full bloom to actually mobilize the idealist generation of that cycle to stop moaning and groaning about those halcyon days earlier in their career when they thought they were going to change the world and that everything was going to be rosy, but they're going to now have to come to grips with the hard work that's going to be involved in partnering with the civic generation of this cycle to actually address this crisis. That was the, but I was asserting that I believe that if we approach this with full knowledge of what it is that's getting ready to happen, it isn't going to be necessary for your generation or my generation to have the crisis fully upon us before we mobilize and we establish our partnership to actually attempt to address this crisis before it comes into full flower. Now, it was my hope that all 100% of you understood what it was that I was saying. This is a very smart group of people we have here. They've gone to some lengths to make sure that you are. So I'm sure that all of you understood what I was saying, but I'm hoping that at least 10% of you or more actually not only understood me, but actually undertook to critique some of the things that I was saying, so that you didn't just sit there and say, oh gee, it must be true what he's telling me. Because that's part of the challenge that you have as public intellectuals, is not to just sit there and listen to the news and believe what they say, or listen to the president and believe what he says, or for that matter, just listen to me and believe what I say. And so I was hoping that at least some percentage of you would have discovered that my assertion that, Strauss and Howe have identified this 100-year cycle, some people might think wasn't exactly accurate, because they actually talk about an 87-year cycle. But the fact of the matter is that the 87 years that they set forth as the terms of the cycle actually begin right when the new crisis starts, or the last crisis gets resolved, and then kicks in right when the next one takes place. And that each of these crises, if you look at the period that it took for them to come into full flower, they take anywhere from 11 to 15 to 16 years during that period. For example, with the crisis, the most recent one, the economic depression of 1929, all the way through to 1945. You had that entire period when this crisis was upon the world. And the American Civil War took the 11 years from the Dred Scott case all the way to the resolution of the Civil War. And the same thing took place with regard to our American Revolution, from the earliest ruminations of it to its full manifestation with the new Constitution. So that what I've done is I have used that concept of the 100-year cycle so that people can understand that this, while it doesn't coincide directly with the change of the centuries, that it happens every century, every 100 years, that this thing happens over and over again. And you might also note that you might have noted that the figures that I had set forth for the size of the generations is a bit different than Strauss and Howe set forth. But while Strauss and Howe suggest that the generation is anywhere from 21 to 22 years, the fact is that when they identified the baby boom generation, the idealist generation, he had it running only from 1943 to 1960. That it's only 17 years. And therefore they were basically robbing us in the idealist generation of 1961, 62, and 63, of all of the kids that were born all the way up to the assassination of President Kennedy, from the February 3rd collapse of the Fifth Army of Germany in front of the gates of Stalingrad, that basically communicated the fact that the Second World War was won basically as of that point, and that the rest of the period of the war was basically just mopping that up. So that whole period, if you actually give a full 20-year period, even to the baby boomers, and add those amount in, it goes up from the 79 million that Strauss and Howe had quoted. You add another 12,600,000 people to that, and you get up to 92 million of the baby boom generation. And then you notice also that they stole some from your generation. They actually had your generation only being 18 years. And if you give you back the additional years that they took from you, it's an additional 14 million of you. That I think my little thing is conking out here. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't notice your hair blowing back from it being that loud. But anyway, so the bottom line is that I have in fact, gone through and looked at all those figures and have really seen that the size of your generation and the size of our generation, the baby boom generation, are both substantially larger than Strauss and Howe give us credit for, giving us only 17 years, you only 18 years. So I've adjusted the figures for your having a full 20 years of your generation and our having a full 20 years of our generation. So that those types of critiques, and you may have noticed that some of the specifics that I was giving with regard to the global climate change, there are a number of people who don't agree with those projections. There are some, in fact, who are now recently elected into the chairmanships of the United States Senate last Tuesday night, who in fact don't believe it's true at all, and will continue to say so. And so there's even some people who are proponents of the thesis who don't agree with all the particulars, but what I've done is that I'm just suggesting that you actually get a copy of the November 1st report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You can just pull it right up on the internet and you can get it. And when you look at the top end of the projections that they're making, and that they have proven in all 4 of their previous projections, they projected less than was really going to happen. And we're always surprised each time they actually check the figures to find that in fact their projections were more optimistic than actually has happened. So what I've done is I've taken the top end numbers when I was explaining to you what I believed was getting ready to happen. So I've taken the top end numbers rather than their more conservative numbers. So that, and I would also suggest that in addition to pulling this up on the internet and taking a look at this, because this is going to be a central feature of the work that our 2 generations do together in the next 20 years of dealing with this thing. So you should really take a look at this. And secondly, I might recommend that there is a course that is being taught online now by Harvard University, Environmental Studies E130 rather, that it actually is the full science of analyzing global climate change and the full social and political implications of what is projected, so that you could just, you can take it pass-fail if you want, but there's a telephone number here, and I want to see everybody writing now. You can call this telephone number if you want to take that course, okay? And it'll give you all the information. It has an entire syllabus with reading list and everything, so that you can have that data. And one of the things that I discovered down through the years is that you take some of these courses and you gather all of the reading materials together and you put them in your library so that you have those things, because part of your education in the 4 years that you're undergraduate school, and then your 3 years of law school, or 4 or 5, 6 years of your PhD work and master's work, what you want to do is you want to assemble the actual data that you need to have. You don't have to read it all, you don't have to deal with all of it, but you're going to want to have it as the years go by. I've discovered this, that this is part of my advice to you, being 45 years out now from law school, that there's over and over and over again. I say, boy, am I glad I kept my notes from the class and I kept the readings, etc. We've got this great library actually over at our office here at the Galleria, right over by the Santa Cruz bookstore, across the street from it in the Galleria. We've got a major library where all of those materials from the courses that I've taken and some that other of our staff have taken, their books are there, their materials are there, and they're available for you to come over to take a look at if you want to see these things. Okay, so that was, and so I closed the session on Monday with the rather extraordinary, yes. Oh, see, that was really good. See, I was just checking to make sure. Okay, it's area code 617-395-4204. And the professors there are William Moomaw, M-O-O-M-A-W, and Timothy Weisgard. Okay, so you just call them and you can sign up for that. and tell them that I said you could, and that so that they'll let you sign up for that if you want to do that. And my guess is it is going to take an awful lot to just stay up with it, and you get access to the materials, etc. Okay? As I say, I closed Monday's gathering together with the rather extraordinary proclamation that was made by Professor Crane Brinton, the longtime chair of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University, on December 20th of 1967, when he was asked to, in his final lecture, after 50 years at Harvard, in Oxford, 35 years of being the chair of the department, to identify the most important single intellectual insight that he believed that the greatest minds in the human family had come to over the years that he'd been studying. And as I told you, he opened the lecture and simply told everybody there that he believed that the greatest minds of our human family in all the periods that he'd been studying had come to the common conclusion that our human family was actually on the very brink of the next evolutionary step in our biological evolution, and that we were evolving a new faculty, a faculty like seeing or hearing, and that pursuant to this faculty, we were able to directly experientially discern the unitive phenomenon that bound every single irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into one unified harmonic whole. And that by means of this experience, like seeing or hearing, the experience of this faculty, that one could actually discern what conduct, human conduct, either individual or collective, was either harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe. And that this is the underpinning premise of the natural law concept that is at the root of our American Constitution. And what I want to do today is I want to do two things. I want to first discuss briefly the import of our recent elections, since this is, of course, on not only Reality 101 of the nature we're talking about with Crane Brinton, but also Politics 500. And that is to understand the nexus between the kind of logistical information about the political reality going on around us and how it relates to the larger political realities that we'll deal with here in this course. So what I want to do is I want to touch upon that and then close with some of the more, the deeper implications of what it is that we saw happen on Tuesday night. Okay, so what we saw on Tuesday night, of course, everybody's pretty familiar with it by this time, that the Senate Republicans, won a majority of the votes in the seats in the United States Senate. They increased by 15 seats their majority in the House of Representatives, and virtually all of the television networks just started blathering the same line. The same line, by the way, that Fox Television began. And that is that this set of voting was in fact a clear and resounding repudiation on the part of the American people of the ideas and programs of Barack Obama and the Democratic Party. And that they went on and on about Barack Obama being a socialist, and that the American people were not into socialism, and that they were speaking out now, and that they wanted to return to the basic sound values of the American culture, the healthy heartland, as they refer to it. And they pointed out that they were having some discussion about whether or not to characterize the election as a shellacking on the part of the Republican Party or a drubbing. And they would have these cutesy debates going back and forth on their little panel of talking heads as to what the right term was to be used for this. As long as it was basically the same idea, they would all kind of agree on that. And so that's what was going on. And what happened is this has even been taken up by the New York Times. Immediately, the next morning, there was a major article in the New York Times by Jonathan Martin saying, voters' second thoughts on hope and change. Okay? That somehow the American people had abandoned their desire to have any change and had basically given up hope that the Democratic Party could actually deliver on this. And what he points out peculiarly, and we'll touch upon why that is in a moment, he suggests that the reason that the Democratic Party did so poorly in these elections is because the Democratic Party had moved too far left of center. That they had somehow abandoned the wise course that had been charted by Bill Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Conference, started by Gebhardt back at the end of the Cold War, 1992. Richard Gebhardt from Indiana proposed that the Democratic Party, now that the Soviet Union had dissolved, that the Democratic Party should in fact become a new, more moderate Democratic Party. And that they should in fact move away from the kind of left policies like Social Security and health care and other kinds of things like that that the kind of socialist European countries had been experimenting with. And that therefore Bill Clinton came out being basically a classic Republican. That he basically ended up advocating NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Zone, deregulating a lot of the industries, and basically catering to a lot of the Republican agenda, which showed that he was able to get along with them. In fact, that went on from 1992 to 1994, and then there was a huge influx of Republican votes came in, and they brought in more people in the House and Senate, and therefore it was basically, wasn't characterized as a repudiation of his policies of accommodating the Republicans. And so what happened from that point forward, he could use the excuse that he had to get along with the Republican-controlled Congress, and so therefore he would actually nominate for federal judicial positions Republicans instead of Democrats, because Orrin Hatch, who chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee from Utah, wouldn't call up any of his nominations if they were Democrats. And so in order to demonstrate that he could get along, Bill Clinton would nominate Republicans, and thought that that was a great demonstration of how he could get along with it. And so you hear right away both the Republicans and Democrats and virtually all of the pundits on the television networks the following day saying, well, maybe they're going to be actually able to get along now. They can get some things done, like, for example, corporate income tax reform. Like they can reduce the amount of income tax for corporations. And they can have other kind of decisions, like reforming the income tax level for rich people, like have them pay even less taxes than they do now. In short, that he could go along with the Republican agenda. And if he's willing to go along with the Republican agenda, maybe he can get something done and break all this gridlock that's going on in Washington. Okay, so that was the framing that was going on. Right, the last 2 days since the election, they're framing the data of the election, suggesting that it was a repudiation of Obama's politics, and that Obama's politics were too far to the left of center, and they should actually move now to the right and be able to accommodate the new conservatives that are in the House and Senate. Now, this is a classic example of the term they use called framing. And I would suggest that you take a look at some of the writings of George Lakoff, that you may have heard about him before, you may not because you've been so busy in school. But for those of you who are not in political science, George Lakoff is the professor of cognitive linguistics at Berkeley. And he has written a number of books in which he is suggesting that the way to get things done in American politics is to frame complex data in simple terms that are consistent with certain folk metaphors. And that if you do this, you can get the people to respond in this almost like neuro-linguistic programming, kind of this Pavlovian response that you can get from the electorate if you frame things adequately. And so he has written a number of books, one of which is called Moral Politics, how Republicans and Democrats think. And he's suggesting that Republicans actually think in terms of the state as a strict father, and that they respond accordingly, that the strict father is domineering and assertive and kind of aggressive and threatening, and that they see that as a positive thing. And that's how they want their state to be, muscled up, tough, aggressive on the international level. And that the Democrats see the state as a nurturing mother. And that therefore there's this kind of feminine, take care of people, give people what they need, and give them health benefits, and help them when they're unemployed. You know, when the little boy falls down and skins his knee, help him up and kiss his knee and take care of him. And so he says that, you know, these are the basic templates that the Republicans and Democrats are operating with. And so if you want to stimulate the Democratic voters, you do the latter. And if you want to stimulate the Republican votes, you do the former. And he in fact has set this forth, and it actually got to the point where the Republicans were the ones that were listening to this. And the Republicans started engaging in very simple framing. And in fact, you remember with W. Bush, when he was saying that, well, the reason that we have to invade Iraq is because otherwise there's going to be a mushroom cloud. We'll all be living under, what are we supposed to wait until we're all sitting under a mushroom cloud? We've got to go in and dig out these people because they're attempting to build nuclear weapons over there. And we've got to go get them, right? And so they just said this over and over again. Dick Cheney said it over and over again. Condoleezza Rice said it over and over again. Bush kept saying it over and over again. And so that you go out into the average restaurant around the country, in the middle of the country, and they'll say, well, sure, we have to go attack Iraq, you know, otherwise we're going to be under a mushroom cloud. And they would just say it, just like that, kind of this Pavlovian response that they had. In Lakoff, actually, it went so far as Karl Rove, one time, he was quoted in the Huffington Post that he was talking to one of the Democratic political organizers. He said, you know what your guys' problem is you're still functioning with a fact-based reality. That's what he said to him. And that is, of course, that spells very well Ronald Reagan. You know, we're not supporting the Contras. You know, oh, those Contras. Okay, they're like the founding fathers. These Contras are like the founding fathers, and so we have to help these people. You know, because the Sandinista are these child-eating communists, and you know they're a Soviet stooge here in South America. And if we don't stop them, they're going to be getting in tanks and coming up to the Harlingen district of Texas, which is just a few short miles from our coast, from our borders. And this is the stuff that Ronald Reagan would say. And the people out there are going, oh, communists attacking us across our borders in the South. And they would respond to that. And you know, in fact, a little sidebar, Ronald Reagan, back before he was governor in the state, Ronald Reagan actually used to broadcast the baseball scores on the radio. He always he wanted to be a baseball commentator. So he actually had this show where he would, all he got was a ticker tape. He would get a ticker tape, and the ticker tape would come in, and all it would say to you is that, you know, the person hit a ball to the shortstop, and the shortstop threw the ball to the first baseman, and the guy was out. That's all it would tell you. But he would get into a very dramatic account. He would say, oh, it's a hard hit ground ball. It's a diving catch. He gets up, he grabs it, he throws it, he barely gets him at first base. But he would cheer like this. And he said, so I used to do this. He said he was bragging about this, how he lent color to these kind of basic information that he had. And then one time he said, but his favorite time is when, in fact, the ticker tape broke. And he had to make up the game. And he just made up a game of how it was going and making up facts and it was going along. And he bragged about that. That was his favorite show. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if it's right time
That's
to
right.
ask questions.
Sure.
I wanted to ask about the generational cycle.
Yes.
Has it ever happened before, or does it usually happen that generations from the past team up with the generations that are about to take on this crisis, or is that a new thing that struck?
Oh no, it's happened every single time. that every single time in these crises, that when you look to see what the coalition is that comes together to actually grapple with this. For example, going back into the most recent one with the crisis of the Great Depression in 1929, that what you had was the civic generation, which was Roosevelt's generation. That entire civic generation, the World War II generation, that entire crowd, they were the civic generation of the 20th century. What they joined together with the progressives of the 20th century, which were the people that were involved in, for example, the Chautauqua movement, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Eugene Debs, and the people who organized and tried to organize women's suffrage, anti-child labor laws, organizing labor unions, for example, public education, the conservation, the post-Civil War black civil rights movement. All of those things came out of the progressive movement. And it was the idealist generation of the 20th century that were actually born in the 1880s and on through, and that they came into full flower, and they rose up to oppose the robber barons. The robber barons who had ascended to power, for example, under McKinley in 1898, and when he was elected, and he had his political boss. His political boss was a guy that used to say things like, when someone would say to him, "What's the highest ambition that any person can possibly have?" And he said, "To make as much money as possible before you die." That was his credo. And and this is the regime under which they took over the Hawaiian Islands. They took over the Philippines. They ended up initiating the war against Cuba and in the Spanish-American War, and seizing all of the area around Cuba and the islands. This is what they were into, and the idealists had risen up to try to oppose them, and yet they weren't successful. They had this huge push against them, and it wasn't successful. But what happened is, because the robber barons and the William McKinleys of the world and everything weren't listening to them in their critique, they went right straight on through, and they had a whole set of things around the bank loans, for example, to give to people to buy stock on the stock exchange, lowering the rules and regulations about stock purchases, etc., until they generated an entire economic collapse. And the economic collapse spread around the world and led to the whole world war. Okay, and so but that alliance, that the proposals that were made by the civic generation, the Roosevelt administration, all came from recommendations that were made by the idealists, but they had modified them slightly. For example, rather than having a straight up social net where they would give everybody a minimum income so that they could provide the minimum necessities, they would give them Social Security, and they would give them some health benefits, etc. What they did is they watered everything down, and rather than fundamentally amend the structure of capitalism, what they did is they put in some regulations. They set up these regulatory agencies, the National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Communications Commission. They set up like 24 of these major regulatory agencies that were all set up under the Roosevelt administration, all of which the fundamental premises of them had come from the idealists. They were basically semi-socialist in their intent, but that they modified them dramatically to leave the capitalist system in place, allow the banking system to go on, and the fractional banking and the Federal Reserve and all of the things that they had set up. They didn't fundamentally amend the structures. They just tinkered with them a bit. Okay, and what happened is, because they failed to radically address the underlying fallacies and shortcomings of the structural system, that it continued to go on. These things continue to go on. So we come into our generations now, in the 21st century, and the seeds of this crisis have been sown in the previous compromises that were made. Okay, so that you can track that in Strauss and Howe's book. You can read those things, and they'll show you the details of how this exact alliance was structured each time. Okay, so that's the thing that I'm recommending here. So the question here that we have is that in facing the political realities that we're facing right now, if you bought into the framing that was going on over the past few days, that you see this horrible wave of reactionary Republicans coming into power, and that therefore we're all going to get, you know, basically dragged off by these borderline cretins that are now governing, that are in the Congress. That you have people, for example, an interview with the guy on CNN, or you know, he was on MSNBC with Chris, whatever his name is. That he was interviewing the guy who's now going to be the chairman of the Senate committee that has jurisdiction over the Environmental Protection Agency, and he was actually supporting. There were a couple bills here that he was actually speaking on behalf of two bills that were in the House Resolution 662, which is blocking all U.S. financial contributions to the International or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to do not allow any U.S. funds to be given to them to do their research. There was another bill, House Resolution 910, which was to block the Federal Environmental Protection Agency from providing any evidence as to the causes of global climate change to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations. He was supportive of those because he said that it wasn't true, that he had read the information provided by the corporate-funded scientists, both of them, in the face of over 2,000 global environmental scientists that have been working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he said that he believed them. And it turns out that he is primarily funded by the petroleum industry, are the people who are funding his election. And so that if you accepted those frames, you'd be pretty depressed right now, which is the idea that they have in mind, is to have you be depressed, have you feel powerless, have you believe that basically the American people have moved dramatically to the right, and that we sort of have to accommodate those people now. And President Obama, when he came on November 5th, he had his press conference, and he was providing an alternative frame. What he said is, look, what's happened here is the simple fact that only 1/3 of the people came out and voted in the off-year election. This is an off-year election, and this happens all the time. Only 33%, 34% of the people came out to vote. And he said, and so the Republicans ended up getting 55% or so in these places of the votes of 33% of the people. So these people have actually been elected by only 18% of the people in the country.
Danny, this is probably beside the point, but I have to point out that there's really no way that we can actually know how many votes were logged or counted.
Well, there's a more critical analysis of it about the lack of trust in the voting machines, et cetera. I understand that, but in this particular instance, what we're looking at here is a set of data that is being framed by the two political parties, and that Obama is basically just asserting that, look, the simple fact is that not only did only 34% of the people come out to vote, so that 66% of the people didn't even participate in these elections, but the fact is that the young people between 18 and 35 came out at only like 7% came out to vote. And the black people didn't come out to vote, and the Hispanic people didn't come out to vote, and even surprisingly, the young women, a specific demographic of the young women between 18 and 35, only came out like at 10 or 11%. He said, and these are the constituencies that, in fact, brought Obama into power back in 2008. Okay, and so he said, look, don't panic here. That's all that's happened here, in that we're going to win in the presidential election. And so what you can realistically expect in the very near future, of course, probably January, is Hillary Clinton announcing that she's going to be running for the Democratic nomination, the Democratic Party is going to get all in lockstep with her and say, look, let's not waste any of the resources of the National Democratic Party having a big, expensive primary campaign. Let's not anybody challenge Hillary Clinton for the presidency. Let's have her be the presidential candidate. Let's get behind everybody. Let's focus on taking the Senate back. We need to get the Senate back because of the important judicial nominations. We can't allow the Republicans to control the nominating process. And so we've got to get the Senate back. And they're going to mount a huge fundraising campaign from everybody to try to get them to start giving money starting in January of 2015 for the election in 2016. And they're going to target the Senate, and they're going to say, we're also going to not only take back the Senate, but we're going to try to recover as many votes as we can in the House of Representatives. Okay? And that's what they're going to go for. So you're going to see this huge wave coming on now on the part of the Democratic Party. The intuitionists are going to be your friend. So you want to remember this part. He said, oh, there's this whole intuitionist school of justice in Western civilization. And they say these peculiar things like all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with these inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they splay out this whole kind of ream of fundamental rights that people have. A right to free speech, and freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of the press. They come out with all of these kind of particulars from some kind of vague intuitional realm of some sort. And he didn't say what it was. He didn't really get to the bottom of it much, but he set it forth, and he said that therefore he thought that what happened in Western civilization now is that when confronted with a particular public policy problem and a range of solutions that are being proffered to it, the collective in Western civilization, instead of selecting that option that would generate simply the greatest good for the greatest number, they would actually select the option that generates the greatest good for the greatest number, but at the same time does at least something for the least well off. Now, if you want to have a paradigmatic description of liberalism, that's it, okay? And so what he did is he set forth this entire theory of justice, this kind of liberal theory of justice that he viewed as a balance that had been struck between the utilitarians and the intuitionists in Western civilization. And then he lays out a whole set of analysis about how this would be applied in certain circumstances, right? And so I said, oh, great, this is terrific. I said, this must explain it. You know, obviously, Bailey and the rest of these guys, the guys at Cahill and the other firms that I was at, they're all utilitarians. They're all trying to figure out the kind of self-interest of the people they represent. And they're not really trying to figure out the best solution for things justice-wise. And so I must be one of these kind of intuitionists. So what I did is I get on the phone, and Monday morning I call up over to John Rawls' office, because I was right there in Boston. And over the phone, I kind of wagged my school tie at them and said, you know, oh, I graduated from the college in '67, the law school, the divinity school, blah, or the law school at that point. And I said, I'd like to have maybe 10, 15 minutes to talk to Professor Rawls about his new book. And so they called back and said, good, okay, you got 20 minutes, you get to come over and see him. So I went over to sit down and talk to him. So I'm sitting there with the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, and I'm discussing the cases that I had done. You know, with the Pentagon Papers and the Attica prison case that everybody was killed there, and a whole series of things that I'd done in the few years that I'd been out of law school. And he was completely captivated by why anybody that was so directly and concretely involved in a lot of these cases would really care about kind of an abstract concept like this, about the different theories of justice. And I said, look, it's got a real concrete problem here. I'm trying to figure out how to persuade F. Lee Bailey, you know, to do something good for the world. I've sat with the senior partners at Cahill, the #1 litigation firm in the world, trying to talk with them how they shouldn't be asking me to represent A&P to justify their discriminatory pricing in the ghetto areas, that they should be not doing that. And I can help them understand how to stop doing that, but they weren't listening. And I said I felt kind of inadequate because I couldn't figure out how to persuade them to not do this anymore and to do what I was trying to talk them to. I said, so I really want to talk to you about how I would go about kind of you know, preparing myself better to help persuade these people. And so he said, what you ought to do is you ought to come back to the university You know, you graduated from college in 67, the law school in 70. You ought to come back and do your PhD work, comparing and contrasting the two different modes of ethical reasoning, the intuitionist school and the utilitarian school. And so I said, that's a good idea. I don't want to stay at Bailey's office anymore, so I'll sign up and I'll come back. So I came back, and I came back to the university that fall in '73. And when I got to the school, I thought I was going to end up being in the Department of Philosophy, studying with Rawls. But Rawls had assigned me over to study under Dr. Ralph Potter, who was the professor of comparative social ethics at the school. And he was based at the Divinity School. So I ended up actually being enrolled in the Divinity School, at Harvard Divinity School, and studying under Dr. Ralph Potter. And it was Dr. Ralph Potter that told me this thing that I'm going to share with you now. They're the most important thing that I think I've probably ever learned in the realm of politics. What he said is this. He said that if in fact you're, as a community, faced with a particular public policy problem, you're going to always get a set of alternative proposals as to how to address that public policy problem. And they're always going to follow a certain pattern, that the community will always divide itself into 5 basic different groups. He said, and that one of these groups, he said, is a group that you can call the right systematists. And at the far end of a spectrum, of a straight political spectrum, you're going to have another group that are left systematists. And just on this bar graph, the sociological bar graph, which was actually designed by Talcott Parsons, who was the chair of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University for 30 years before David Reisman came in. And Ralph had studied under Talcott Parsons. And Parsons is the one that designed this left-right political spectrum of right-wingers and left-wingers that you hear about. You probably thought it had always existed forever, but it didn't. He said, and that it turns out that inside the left systematists, right systematists, you have another group that's called left marginalists. And, of course, right marginalists, he said. And to no one's great surprise, in the middle, you had middle marginalists. And he said that your community will divide itself into 5 different groups, and they'll each propose a solution to your problem, but they'll be completely different than each other because they're predicated upon a whole set of different assumptions about facts and reality. And so what Ralph Potter had spent his time doing, and he wrote his PhD thesis at Harvard on this, was trying to figure out what the factors were that caused a person to be either a left systematist, left marginalist, right systematist, or right marginalist, or a middle marginalist. And so that what he discovered, and I want to, we've got a little bit of time, right? I want to just explain to you what Ralph Potter determined after years of study on this, is he determined that there were basically 4 basic factors that went into determining whether what particular worldview a person was going to have. And you'll find if you look into this stuff with Ralph Potter, and Potter's box they call this, that you'll find all kinds of different proffers being put into these boxes. I had the privilege of spending the 2 full years with Ralph Potter and cornering him and pounding on him and harassing him to tell me what the bottom line was on this, because I'm a functionalist. I said, I'm not here, figuring out how many, angels dance on heads of pins. I'm here because I'm going back into practicing law, and I'm trying to figure out how to get something done here. So I said, stop giving me 5 different options of what's in each one of these boxes. Tell me what the bottom line is. And he said, all right, I'll tell you. He said that the 4 fundamental beliefs that a person comes to about these 4 things are what determine her or his worldview. And the first one is their cosmology Why do these things always stop working? Okay? The person's cosmology. And that is, what is the person's assumption about how the whole universe came into being? The issue that Scott was talking with your 7-year-old about the other day. Okay? And the 7-year-old says, oh, what is this? What am I supposed to think about how the universe came into being? Like this Big Bang theory. He said, what does that mean? That, you know, a dump truck sort of ran into a lollipop and dumped the stuff and the universe came into being? That was what he said. Which was pretty good for a 7-year-old kid. But so the question is, what is the person's belief about how the universe came into being? Or do they believe it's always been in existence? Okay? The second fundamental belief is their teleology. And that is, what do they think the universe is doing now that it's here? Is it expanding and disintegrating? Is it expanding and contracting? Is it, what's it doing? Is there any kind of teleological dynamic pursuant to which the universe is unfolding in some kind of teleological manner towards some type of predictable place or condition? Because if in fact you share different beliefs about that, you're going to have fundamentally different worldview. Okay? In the third, what they call pillar beliefs, these are the 4 pillar beliefs of a worldview. So the third one is the ontological belief, which when you shake it down, it's basically the question of consciousness. How did consciousness come into existence in the physical universe? If you have a physical universe of stones and elements and chemicals all manifesting themselves, how did consciousness arise in the midst of this phenomenon? And what's the nature of consciousness? Is it substantive? Is it a mirage? Is it a subfunction of the arbitrary interaction between mass and energy? There's some kind of epiphenomenon of a physiological nature? Did it exist beforehand? Maybe did consciousness exist beforehand? In that the material realm is all a manifestation of consciousness. These are the questions we're going to be talking about in the course, relating them to direct worldviews that have to do with political views. Okay? So this is the ontological question. And the fourth and final one of these was the epistemological question. Epistemology. And that is the question of what means do we have as human beings, individually and collectively, what means do we have at our disposal by means of which we can possibly answer cosmic questions like this? Are we confined, for example, to the simple experience of our 5 senses, then processed through our intellect in our brain to process them all out, even magnified with artificial devices that magnify our sight and our hearing and even our thinking with computers? Is it a linear process of some sort? Is that all we have functioning? Or do we possibly have other types of faculties? Ergo, the Crane-Brinton observation, that it is postulated by the greatest minds of our entire history of our world that we are evolving a new faculty, like sight, like hearing. Like sight, as we know, evolved over millions of years in living beings to be able to resonate and respond to a pre-existent phenomenon of light. It's a particular electromagnetic frequency. It's got a particular pitch and amplitude. It's a phenomenon. It's a physical phenomenon. And somehow, through the millions of years, rose up the design of an entire faculty, organs of faculty, that were able to directly, experientially resonate with this particular phenomenon and translate it into data about the outside world. The same thing is true with hearing, that over millions of years they're evolved in a teleological manner. A certain set of organs that were able to directly resonate with a particular electromagnetic frequency of sound and give us data intake about the outside world. I mean, just think how peculiar it is to be able to sit here like this with your back turned and realize that someone is walking into the room, 100 feet away. And the people who didn't know anything about hearing say, how the hell did she do that? In fact, H.G. Wells wrote a story back in 1942 about a young woman who lived high in the Andes in a community that all had tissue over their face. And she had somehow started to discern light and shadows through the tissue on her face. And she could tell when people were moving in the room, even if they didn't make any noise. And it freaked everybody out. And so they ended up killing her. Which tells you a lot about the fate of prophets. And why prophets, in fact, are biological mutations who are evolving this faculty that Crane Brinton is talking about, and that they're developing it teleologically, but in fact it flashes into full manifestation prior to the culture of the human family being prepared to cope with it. And so what happens is that these beings, like all mutations happen in biology, is they flash into existence, but the environment isn't prepared for them and they die. And yet they keep on coming until they adjust to the environment and they survive. And this is what is being talked about here. But these four pillar beliefs, cosmology, teleology, ontology, and epistemology, are the four pillar beliefs that a human being will come to that actually determines their worldview. Because if in fact you provide an answer to each of these four questions, each of which is completely internally and self-referentially consistent with the answers to the other three questions that you've asked, it will in fact generate a common principle pursuant to which you can then apply the principle to all kinds of practical questions, and it becomes a mode of ethical reasoning. A mode of ethical reasoning which causes you to conduct yourself, not surprisingly, in accordance with what you assume is real. It's the most fundamental guiding ethic, is you conduct yourself in accordance with what you think is real. The trick about these particular things is that there's no way right now of telling for sure what the answer is. Nobody knows definitively at this point in time what the answer to these questions are. We're still probing and exploring these things. So the fact of the matter is, virtually every person, whether consciously or unconsciously, comes to form some type of opinion about these fundamental aspects of reality. In fact, there's a famous saying of philosophy, the entire endeavor of philosophy is attempting to provide the epistemological answer to the ontological question. Okay, and what Crane Brinton has done is he has provided that answer. He has said that epistemologically, the greatest minds in the human family have come to the epistemological conclusion that there is in fact another faculty that is actually biologically evolving in a teleological manner into full fruition that enables every individual, in accordance with the state of development of that faculty, to be able to actually discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into one harmonious whole. And that by means of that, she or he can in fact determine experientially what conduct is either harmonious or disharmonious with the natural order of being. Okay? So this is as I said, if a person intuitively or pursuant of every intellectual piece of data and scientific data that you can possibly gather, you come to some operating conclusion about what the answers are to the cosmological question, and you come to some kind of conclusion, operational conclusion, is what the teleological process is of the unfolding of the universe. And you come to some operative conclusion as to what the role of the consciousness is and how consciousness came into being. And epistemologically, what faculties you have by means of which you can discern the answers to these questions. If you provide internally and self-referentially consistent answers to all four of those questions, it will in fact generate, as I said, a specific mode of ethical reasoning, if you can find a marker that works. If you can't, you're just going to have to guess at what the hell that is. But it's over there, right down there. It's the mode of ethical reasoning. Okay? And what's more, if you apply that same mode of ethical reasoning consistently to all of the basic questions that arise in a normal person's life, it will generate a philosophy. That's where philosophy comes from. That's where the different philosophies arise, is they come from the different modes of ethical reasoning that are generated by answering these questions. And once you have a particular philosophy in place, one of the derivative aspects of your philosophy is your political philosophy. And so what you discover is that there is, in fact, a political spectrum that, are there any of these things anywhere around? What do I do here? Anyway, I guess not. This may be one of those things we write and it never goes off the board. Dry erase, it is. Okay, here we go. Well, that's wrong. I guess it's not bright enough. Here we go, red. Red is good. Okay, here we go. All right, there we go. Okay. So what I discovered is that the right systematists over here and the left systematists here, and your left marginalists here, and your right marginalists here, and your middle marginalists here. In fact, what I was designing my master's thesis on at Harvard University, the Divinity School, my MTS, was in fact that I think he made a mistake. That in fact Talcott Parsons came up short. It isn't 5 groups that you actually fall into, it's actually 7. That in fact, what you have here is the right systematists are authoritarians. And the right marginalists are reactionaries. And that there's a new one is called a right middle marginalist. And this is a conservative. And your middle marginalists, of course, are your moderates. And your left middle marginalists are your liberals. And your left marginalists are your progressives. And your left systematists are your utopianists. And there they are. There's the political spectrum that you hear so much about all the time. And it's why when you hear all these bizarre talking heads on all these television shows, and they're referring to people kind of recklessly as a conservative or a moderate or something, you never hear them talk about them being reactionaries, though you know perfectly well that's what they are. And they certainly don't talk about them being authoritarians because they don't like those people anymore. But the reality is here it is. Here is the spectrum of political worldviews. And that what happens is that in addition, flowing from the philosophy that is generated by the application of the mode of ethical reasoning, the mode of ethical reasoning here, that when you apply this to, as I said, to the everyday important questions that arise in a person's life over the course of their lifespan, it generates a philosophy, an entire philosophy. And that, as I said, that these political philosophies are in fact derivative of the philosophy. And if it's done with rigor and intellectual acuity, there is precision in this entire process. And that's what you're after. As intellectuals, you're after precision. You want clarity in your thinking. that the position that you're going to be espousing publicly to people to try to address this oncoming crisis isn't just something that you pull out of the sky. You know, that you know, everybody, actually there's an old saying that a CIA guy told me one time, which since we're in secret, he said, you know, Danny, opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one. That's the CIA. All right. So the fact that you got an opinion about something doesn't mean shit, actually, because people will not resonate to it simply because you happen to have an opinion. What they will do is they will resonate to it if, in fact, it's consistent and has integrity and it relates to something cosmic. And that they can tell that when you're communicating with them. And you'll discover that if you're clear and you're systematic and you're rigorous in your thinking, that in fact you will discover that people don't all agree with you. There are people who have a different worldview. But what you can do is you can challenge them and say, okay, tell me about your worldview. Tell me what it is you believe about these things so that I can understand why it is you're saying what you're saying. And then you have a meaningful and intelligent debate going on. And it's important for you to know that the derivative of one's philosophy is not only one's political philosophy, but is also one's whole theory of human psychology. Is derivative of your philosophy, as is your whole mode of spiritual expression is a function of your philosophy, which is in fact a function of your belief about these things. And also your whole social theory of how a community should organize itself and how you go about gathering information and sharing views in your community to come to a collective decision. How you believe in these things will determine what that is. Okay? And so what we'll do is we will later in the course, we'll talk about what the particular alternative answers are to these questions. And I'll just close with a brief example just to hopefully whet your intellectual appetite for our gathering on Monday and say that, look, cosmologically, if you believe that the cosmos kind of came into existence through the Big Bang, right? And teleologically, it's just expanding out and away from the locus of the original Big Bang. And every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe is in fact disintegrating from its larger elements all the way on the periodic scale, all the way from U-238, all the way down to helium. You know, that if they're disintegrating into their constituent elements as they're expanding and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and that ultimately there'll come a point in time when every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe will have disintegrated into its separate component inchoate quantum fields. And it will then thereafter continue to expand out and away from every other one into no thingness. That's a pretty fucking pessimistic worldview. But the fact of the matter is, that is the basic assumption of the authoritarians. And that's why the world is a world of chaos. That's why our world has no inherent real value. There's no ultimate referent for right and wrong other than the most powerful. The person who's the most powerful and can impose his will upon others is the one who rules and dominates. Because it's necessary. They're not in bad faith on that. They actually believe that there's no coherent referent for right and wrong, other than power and assertion. And what they're doing is they're lending order to an otherwise random and chaotic world. And that's what lends reality to a particular realm that they rule in. See, now that's their worldview, and it's a good faith worldview, so it doesn't do any good to just attack them as being malevolent and evil, because the fact of the matter is they have a different worldview than you do. And you certainly are not going to be able to persuade them, say, here, let me tell you about my cosmology. And you say, for example, you're over here at the left systematist thing, and what you say is, what I believe is true is that outside of our physical universe that is made up of the sum total of all of the ultimately irreducible energies of matter in the universe, whether they're in the form of energy or mass, which are more or less interchangeable, that outside of the totality of the total number of units of mass and energy, that there is an infinite and eternal and abiding sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness that in fact enfolded the physical universe into being. That's how the Big Bang occurred, that there was an actual manifestation of consciousness into condensed form that was the original pinhead-sized composite of all of the matter in the universe. And that there was a moment in which every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe, abiding in the size of a head of a pin, the polarity of every single ultimately irreducible integer in inchoate quantum field, reversed its polarity and repelled itself from every other one. Not just from the center outward, but from every other one. And it generated the Big Bang. And it lent impetus to every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter. And they went out and away, forming configurations of mass and energy out into the universe. And they continue to expand out and away from that. But, pursuant to this particular worldview, every single one of those inchoate quantum fields is in fact a unit of consciousness. And that's why directing your intention to such an inchoate quantum field can actually cause it to manifest as either a unit of mass or a wave of energy. And it's why our human intention can actually change reality itself. And that's why the Newtonian Cartesian worldview is incorrect. The classic scientific worldview of the middle marginalists is that nothing exists except that which you can taste, touch, feel, measure, weigh. And they won't acknowledge that anything is real until it's proven. Even though they'll acknowledge that it might be, it's conceivable of. But they won't acknowledge that anything is true until it's been absolutely proven and replicated. And so they have a different worldview entirely. And so it's these worldviews that we're going to be working with in the course. And we're going to be discussing consistently what the relationship of these different worldviews are and what their takes are on this thesis that Crane Brinton has asserted. That there is in fact evolving in our human family a new faculty by means of which we can directly and experientially encounter, like seeing or hearing, the unitive phenomenon that bonds every one of these ultimately irreducible energies of matter into a unified harmonic whole. That is the experience that resides at the base of mystical experience. That is the warp and the woof of prophecy. And it is the secret asset that we have as prophets who are public intellectuals. That's your job.